The city roared like a beast that never slept. Cars shouted at one another in endless streams of horns. Neon screens flickered with advertisements begging for attention, and the people moved as if chased by invisible clocks. In the middle of this storm lived Adrian, a man who carried silence inside but never dared to open it. Every morning began the same. His phone exploded with notifications before his feet even touched the floor. Emails, messages, reminders, the endless scroll of news. He brushed his teeth while half-reading headlines, ate breakfast while watching short videos, and walked to work with earphones drowning out the world. His life was full yet strangely empty. One evening, while riding the subway home, he noticed a strange detail. An elderly man sat across from him, still and calm. No phone in hand, no newspaper, no distractions. Only his eyes softly closed as if he was listening to something deeper. Around him chaos raged. Conversations, screens, rushing footsteps. But the old man sat untouched, as if silence itself had chosen to sit beside him. For the first time, Adrian felt jealous of silence. That night, the noise inside his head refused to rest. Thoughts collided like storms. Unfinished tasks, fears of the future, regrets of the past. He tossed and turned, but the more he fought, the louder the noise grew. At 3 a.m., exhausted, he rose from bed and looked out the window. The city lights blinked like restless eyes, but somewhere far in the distance, he imagined a space where silence still lived. The next morning, something inside him cracked. He walked past a small park near his office and heard birds cutting through the early air. For a moment, just a moment, he stopped. No phone, no rush, no sound but their wings. And in that fragile pause, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Clarity. Adrian didn't yet know it, but he had touched the edge of a forgotten truth. The power of silence to transform. Silence is not empty. It is not nothingness. It is a mirror, a healer, a teacher. Silence holds what words cannot. In silence, the mind breathes. In silence, wounds begin to close. But most people, like Adrian, spend their lives running from it, filling every corner with noise because they fear what they might hear if everything went quiet. Adrian began to wonder, what would happen if he stopped running? What would happen if he dared to empty his mind and listen? That question would soon take him on a journey, one that would strip away his distractions, force him to face himself, and ultimately reveal how silence can become the most powerful force in life. The story had begun with noise, but its true strength was waiting in the quiet. Adrian did not decide with a grand announcement. There was no dramatic vow, no sudden promise to change his life. Instead, the shift began quietly, like water dripping onto stone. One morning, as he prepared to rush into another busy day, he hesitated. His hand hovered above his phone, ready to open the flood of notifications. But he remembered the old man on the subway, the stillness in his eyes, and he stopped. For the first time in years, he left his phone untouched and simply sat. The silence felt heavy at first, like an unfamiliar guest in his own house. Thoughts stampeded into the emptiness. What if someone emailed me? What if I'm late? What if I miss something important? His chest tightened. Silence was not peaceful yet. It was uncomfortable, almost frightening. But instead of running back to the noise, Adrian did something new. He closed his eyes. He listened. At first, all he could hear was the chaos inside. A swirl of unfinished conversations, fragments of tasks, the hum of imagined voices. But slowly, beneath that storm, something softer appeared. The faint sound of his breath, the whisper of air moving in and out of his lungs. A rhythm he had forgotten. That morning lasted only 5 minutes, but it marked the beginning. Adrian began practicing this small ritual daily. He called it his silent pocket. Just 5 minutes before the noise of the day, 5 minutes without screens, without words, without motion. At first, it was a struggle. His thoughts attacked him like restless birds. But after a week, something changed. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Adrian walked home through the park again. The city still roared, but within him, space had opened. When a stranger brushed past him rudely, he did not explode with irritation. When a work email arrived demanding urgent attention, he did not panic. For the first time in years, he felt distance between the world and his reactions, as if silence had placed a gentle shield around him. Yet the real test came one night when he met his friend Clara for dinner. Clara had known him for years, had seen him restless, distracted, always glued to his phone. But this time, she noticed something new. "You're different," she said, narrowing her eyes. "Calmer, like less busy in your head." Adrian smiled. He hadn't noticed it himself, but she was right. His silence was no longer empty. It was shaping him. Still, this was only the doorway. He had learned how to pause, but he had not yet learned how to truly empty his mind. That lesson would come from a place he had never expected. A small retreat hidden deep in the mountains, where silence was not 5 minutes, but 5 days. And so, Adrian's journey into the power of silence was about to deepen. He almost turned back when the bus door hissed shut. But the mountain exhaled, and he stayed. The invitation had arrived like a secret. A folded flyer from Clara, a pale blue paper that smelled faintly of rain. 5 days. No phone. No talking. No reading. Wake to a bell. Sit with your breath. Walk with your feet. Listen. Signal bars vanished as the bus climbed. The city thinned to fields, then forests, then ribs of granite shouldering the sky. Adrian's thumb kept grazing the cold glass of his phone, a habit looking for a reason. There was none. At the final stop, a dirt road led to a low wooden hall with a slate roof and a bell that hung like a moon. A woman in wool and quiet eyes greeted him with a nod, then pointed to a wooden box labeled "Devices." He hesitated, then placed his phone inside. The lid closed with a soft, decisive thud. It felt like a small funeral and a possible birth. They were given simple rooms, a thin mattress, a blanket, a window framing the mountain's throat of pines. On the wall, a single page of rules: noble silence. No eye contact, no gestures, no writing. Be where your feet are. He read the words twice, as if they might leak meaning on the second pass. At dusk, the bell called them. Sandals whispered over gravel. In the meditation hall, 30 people sat facing a whitewashed wall. A teacher entered, bowed, and knelt. Her voice carried like water over stones. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of attention. The first hour dragged like a wagon through mud. Thoughts stampeded, made louder by the room's stillness. He argued with ghosts, edited emails that did not exist, replayed a subway incident from 3 years ago as if it were breaking news. His knees complained, then shouted. He counted breaths. He lost count. He began again. A fly stitched the air. Someone cleared a throat. The bell released them, and the room exhaled. Night widened. In his narrow bed, sleep came and then retreated like a tide that refused the shore. With no screen to distract him, old scenes rose. The time he spoke too sharply to Clara and saw the light in her eyes flicker. The hospital corridor where his father's hand felt both warm and gone. The job offer he declined because fear wore a convincing suit. He tried to push them away. They pushed back harder. He pressed a palm to his chest and felt his heart beating the word stay. Morning arrived like a held note let go. The bell touched the valley. Mist unrolled from the pines. On the path to the hall, he noticed droplets clinging to spider silk, each one a tiny world. Something in him unclenched. During walking meditation, he matched his steps to his breath. Slow, patient, shoe to earth, earth to shoe. When his mind fled, he called it back gently, as one calls a dog from a dangerous road. By the third sit, the weather inside shifted. The river of thoughts still ran, but the banks felt wider. Sounds became distinct instead of sticky. The kettle's soft tantrum, the floorboard's confession, the far-off thrum of a hawk's wings pressing the morning open. For 3 brief heartbeats, there were no arguments, no rehearsals, no future. There was only breath touching breath, a bell striking air. The body heard from the inside. Tears rose without reason and dried without hurry. At lunch, they ate in silence while rain ticked on the roof. He tasted carrot as if it were a sunrise. He chewed rice until it told the story of a field. He noticed how often his hand reached for a pocket that held nothing now but fabric and habit. The reach slowed. The habit blinked and, for a moment, lost his name. In the afternoon, the teacher spoke again. When noise falls away, truth stops hiding. Be brave when it appears. He did not know what truth would look like, or whether he would welcome it when it came. But as dusk folded the mountain and the bell gathered them once more, he understood a small thing perfectly. Silence was not a rule. Silence was a landscape, and he had finally stepped inside it. That night, before sleep, he stood at the window and watched fog climb the dark trees like breath returning to lungs. His mind, though not empty, was less crowded. The door stood open. The air could move. For the first time in years, he trusted morning to arrive without being chased. The city did not sleep, and neither did Daniel's mind. Even when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the buzzing, the notifications, the chatter of half-finished conversations replaying like broken records. Silence, he realized, was not just rare, it was almost forbidden. Wherever he turned, there was sound. Trains roaring under the ground, billboards screaming with colors, voices competing for attention. He began to wonder if perhaps the true disease of the modern world was not hunger or poverty, but noise. One evening, after another long day of meaningless noise, Daniel sat at his small desk, staring at a lamp that flickered like his restless thoughts. His head felt heavy, as if every advertisement, every complaint he had overheard, every fear he had swallowed, had taken a seat inside his brain. He remembered something the old monk had said, "Your mind is like a room. Leave the door open and everything will walk in. One day you must decide who gets to stay." That night, Daniel made a choice. He turned off his phone, shut the window, and sat in silence. At first, it was unbearable. The absence of noise revealed an even louder truth, the noise inside him. Regrets he had buried rose like ghosts. Forgotten promises knocked at the door of his memory. The silence was not peace. It was confrontation, and Daniel wanted to run, but he stayed. Minutes passed like hours. His chest ached. His breath felt shallow. He wanted to reach for the phone, for music, for distraction, but he forced himself to remain still. Slowly, something shifted. The voices in his head began to soften. They were still there, but they no longer screamed. They drifted, like clouds passing a restless sky. For the first time in years, Daniel realized he was not drowning, he was floating. The next morning, he felt lighter. The silence had not solved his problems, but it had cleaned a corner of his mind. He remembered the monk's words, "A cluttered mind cannot see clearly. Silence is the broom." He decided to make silence a ritual. Each morning before sunrise, and each night before bed, Daniel would sit in stillness. At first 10 minutes, then 20, sometimes longer. He began to notice changes. His heartbeat slowed. His thoughts grew less frantic. And most surprisingly, answers to problems seemed to appear on their own, as if the silence itself was speaking. But Daniel's journey had only begun. Silence was not just about stillness, it was about transformation. And soon, life would test whether his fragile calm could survive the storms that were waiting for him. Silence, Daniel discovered, was not always gentle. It was not only a balm but also a blade. In the absence of distraction, memories returned with sharp edges. He began to see himself clearly for the first time, and it was not always a sight he welcomed. One evening, while sitting in stillness, an image appeared in his mind. His younger brother's face, the last time they had spoken. The memory was years old, yet it replayed as if it had just happened. Angry words, slammed doors, pride too heavy to bend. Daniel had buried the guilt under layers of busyness and excuses, but silence pulled it out like a thorn long hidden beneath the skin. His heart tightened. His breath stumbled. The silence was merciless. He almost gave up then, almost ran back to the noise, to the screens and the endless chatter that could drown out the ache. But another memory surfaced, his first encounter with the old monk on the mountain. The monk's words returned, "Silence does not create pain, it reveals it. Only when you see it can you begin to heal." So Daniel sat with the pain. He let the guilt rise, let the tears come. For hours, he felt as if the silence was forcing him to face the parts of himself he had abandoned. Yet, when morning came, something remarkable happened. The guilt was still there, but lighter, as if silence had carried part of its weight away. Days passed, and each silence became a mirror. He saw his impatience at work, the way he snapped at colleagues when deadlines pressed. He saw his habit of running from difficult conversations. He saw how fear had disguised itself as ambition, driving him not toward joy but away from failure. It was not easy to watch, but in these reflections lay truth. And truth, however uncomfortable, had a strange power. It began to set him free. One night, after a long session of silence, Daniel wrote a letter to his brother. The words poured out like water breaking through a dam. Apologies he had resisted, gratitude he had swallowed, memories he had cherished but never spoken. The silence had not only revealed wounds, it had guided him to begin healing them. And with that letter, Daniel understood something profound. Silence was not the absence of life. It was the beginning of a new life. It stripped away lies, excuses, and distractions until only the essential remained. But silence had more to teach him. The deepest lesson was still waiting, not in solitude, but in how he would carry this quiet strength back into the noisy world. Silence in the mountains was easy. Silence in a small room, away from phones and obligations, was possible. But silence in the middle of the city, that was a different kind of trial. When Daniel returned from the retreat, the world seemed louder than before. Cars blared impatient horns, advertisements glared from screens, conversations spilled across the streets. Even his workplace felt like a storm of endless chatter, keyboards clattering, phones buzzing, voices overlapping. At first, he felt crushed again, as if the fragile stillness he had found would vanish under the weight of the city's noise. But then he remembered what the teacher had said before he left. Silence is not a place you go. Silence is a place you carry. So Daniel began to experiment. He took small moments in the middle of chaos and treated them like hidden doors into silence. On the crowded subway, instead of drowning himself in music or scrolling through his phone, he closed his eyes and followed his breath. At work, when tension rose in meetings, he let silence fill the gap between hearing and answering, and to his surprise, his responses became calmer, clearer, less reactive. Slowly, he realized that silence was not about shutting out the world. It was about not letting the world take over his mind. One afternoon, during a particularly stressful day, a colleague lashed out at him unfairly. Normally, Daniel would have defended himself immediately, his words sharp, his pride louder than reason. But this time, he paused. He let the silence hold him for a breath. The anger that rose in his chest dissolved before it reached his lips. Instead of escalating, he spoke softly, and the conflict ended before it began. It was then that Daniel understood another secret of silence. It was power. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that transforms. The kind that turns storms into rain, noise into music, conflict into understanding. People around him began to notice. Clara, his friend, said, "You're not the same. You're lighter." His manager asked if he had started meditating. Strangers on the train even seemed to treat him with more ease, as if silence radiated from him without a word. Daniel smiled, because he knew the truth. Silence was contagious. When one person carried it, the air around them shifted. Still, he was only beginning to glimpse its full strength. For silence was not just about peace in daily life. It was about clarity in the moments that mattered most, moments when choices could change everything. And soon, such a choice would arrive. Life always tests what we claim to have learned. For Daniel, the test arrived on an ordinary Thursday morning, disguised as an email. The subject line was simple: urgent offer, response needed. A prestigious company from another city wanted him. The salary was generous, the position powerful, the kind of opportunity that once would have made his heart race with ambition. But there was a price. He would have to leave his current life behind. The friendships he had nurtured, the fragile reconnection with his brother, and most painfully, the new balance he had built within himself. The noise inside him roared back instantly. His mind spun in circles, each thought colliding with the next. What if I regret saying no? What if I fail if I say yes? What if this is the only chance? He felt the old storm returning, louder than it had been in months. But then he remembered, silence is a guide. So instead of replying, Daniel closed his laptop. He turned off his phone. He walked to the small park where he had first noticed the birdsong months ago. He sat on the same bench, closed his eyes, and let the noise unravel. The thoughts came in waves. Fear, desire, pride, doubt. He did not fight them. He simply watched. Slowly, the storm lost its strength. In its place came a quiet clarity, not shouted but whispered. In that silence, he saw more than numbers on a contract. He saw mornings waking up exhausted in a city even louder than this one. He saw himself chasing status while the friendships that grounded him withered. And then he saw another picture, himself staying, continuing the path he had begun, growing deeper rather than higher, choosing presence over prestige. The answer came not as logic but as peace. When Daniel opened his eyes, the park looked the same. Children playing, leaves trembling in the breeze, but everything inside him had changed. The decision was clear. That evening, he wrote his reply. With calm hands, he declined the offer. Not because he was afraid, but because he was finally unafraid to choose differently. And as he pressed send, silence filled him like light through an open window. He had discovered the final truth. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is direction. But one last lesson still waited for him, the gift silence gives when shared. Daniel had thought silence was a private treasure, something fragile to be guarded in the corners of his day. But life soon showed him that silence, once rooted, was not meant to be kept. It was meant to be shared. It began with small ripples. At work, his calm presence during tense meetings changed the atmosphere. People argued less, listened more. A colleague once said, half joking, "It feels like you bring a pause into the room." Daniel only smiled, but inside he knew it was true. Silence traveled beyond him. With Clara, the change was even more profound. She had always been quick with words, filling spaces with laughter or stories. But one evening, while they shared tea, she grew quiet and looked at him curiously. "You know," she said softly, "I don't feel the need to talk so much when I'm with you. Your silence feels safe." Safe. The word lingered in his chest like a bell. That was the gift silence gave. Not emptiness, but safety. A space where others could rest without pressure, where they could be fully themselves. Even his brother noticed. When they finally met again after years of distance, the reunion was awkward at first, words stumbling, guilt shadowing their eyes. But Daniel didn't rush. He let silence hold the space between them, soft and patient. Slowly, the walls broke. His brother's voice cracked into laughter, then softened into tears. Their bond was not repaired by clever speeches, but by silence that allowed truth to surface. And Daniel understood at last. Silence was not only his teacher. It was a gift he could give the world. From then on, he lived differently. He no longer feared the noise of the city, for he carried a deeper quiet within. He no longer feared his own thoughts, for he had learned to face them. And he no longer feared disconnection, for he had discovered that silence itself could connect people in ways words never could. Years later, when others asked him how he had changed, Daniel would smile and say only this: "Empty your mind. Listen. In silence, you will find everything you thought was missing." The world continued to roar, but within him, silence remained. A constant, a guide, a gift. And those who came near him left carrying a little of that silence with them, like a light they hadn't realized they needed.